Hello everybody and welcome to the Mercy and Trust Send CPD series, a series of 6 sessions over this academic year being offered by the Mercy and Trust CPD programme. My name is Conrad Bourne and I'm the Director for Special Educational Needs at the Mercy and Trust. Just a little bit about me. I was a SENCO for over 10 years and have been a senior leader in secondary school settings. I'm also, for 1 day a week, seconded to the Department for Education's National SEND Leadership Strategy, where I'm one of the West Midlands Deputy Regional Leads for Whole School SEND. The first session today is an introduction to SEND. So what is SEND? The framework for SEND in mainstream schools. And that framework is both what happens in school, what the legal requirements of our SEND offer in school, as well as legislative framework. We're also going to talk to one of our school SENCOs in our trust and look at a little bit more deeply about the role of the SENCO, how that role impacts on school and the day-to-day operation of SEND in school. Then in session 2, we're going to look at every teacher a teacher of SEND. This is an expression you may have heard in literature. But what does it actually mean? What are the expectations of every teacher a teacher of SEND? What are the roles and responsibilities? Do we expect every teacher to be an expert in SEND or have a level of expertise? Do they need to understand all conditions, pupil conditions, learning need conditions? So what are those expectations? We'll try and demystify some of the language around every teacher a teacher of SEND. Then in session 3, we'll look at the characteristics of SEND, particularly when we're thinking about a learner that is not making learning progress. Is it automatically SEND? What are the key characteristics, almost the qualifying aspects of when we decide a learner has got a special educational need? Or is it the fact that they're just not making learning progress in line with their peers? Is there a common characteristic around this learner's learning needs? Or is it subject-based? Is it a specific subject where they are not making progress? We'll try and unpick the process and procedures we must follow when we're trying to make a decision around a learner, whether a learner has SEND or whether it is actually something else. And in session 4, we're moving now to thinking about if we have decided that this learner does have SEND, what actually is then the nature of their SEND? What is their primary need? And by making a decision that this learner does have SEND, what we are saying is that for the teaching, the day-to-day general teaching and curriculum at the universal offer, that does no longer meet that learner's needs. And therefore we need to do something which is called additional to and different from. And it's in italics there because that's a really important aspect of when we're thinking about what we need to be doing at the classroom level for those learners. And in session 5, we start to think about what successful outcomes are for SEND learners. Nowhere in the literature around SEND will you read information around progress 8 targets, for example, or attainment targets, but you will start to see the language of preparation for early adulthood. And in early adulthood, we're talking about a learner going through our school settings through to the ages of 25 or so. How do we prepare those learners to be the most successful adults they can be by that early adulthood? And in session 6, we're starting to think finally about what the most ambitious learning environment can be for learners with SEND. Again, thinking about that we don't necessarily need our teachers and our staff to be experts around SEND, but we do need to offer the most ambitious curriculum. And what differences do we need to offer? What different things do we need to offer, if we do, to SEND learners to enable them to achieve their best outcomes? Now, I did mention in an earlier slide that our schools operate within a legislative framework for special educational needs. Underpinning that legislative framework is the Children and Families Act. Now that covers all aspects of school, not just SEND. But derived from the Children and Families Act is the key document, the key reference document for SEND, which is the SEND Code of Practice 0 to 25. So in this SEND Code of Practice, we codify what we should be doing in schools. And again, this is a document that covers all school and college settings, not just schools, and we'll try and unpick what the school information is from the SEND Code of Practice. Also as well, a little known legislative tool that we need to be aware of is something called the SEND regulations. So when the Children and Families Act was first released, like many acts of Parliament, they have to be tidied up, they have to be clarified. Where there are ambiguities, and there can be many ambiguities, the regulations show us, they give us a framework with which to iron out those irregularities. So it's a document that sits alongside the Children and Families Act, but it is an important document that we will reference moving forward. Also as well is the Equality Act. The Equality Act really underpins our SEND offer and our offer for all learners in many respects, about equity, about access to curriculum, about access to high quality teaching, and ensuring that no student is discriminated against in any way, shape or form due to either learning need, sexual orientation, gender and so on. And again, that's a meaty document, and the DfE have produced a companion document called the Equality Act 2010 for schools. So we've got documents that we are cross-referencing at all times that we need to be mindful of within the SEND legislative framework. Also, our schools have to publish information, and this information in terms of what we need to publish is contained within the Children and Families Act and the SEND regulations. And the key document that we have to publish and publish on our websites is the SEND information report. So this has to be published on the school website and available for all to see, and it has to be reviewed annually. And it comprises set questions that the school must respond to. So there's a range of statements on who the key stakeholders are around SEND in the school, the range of provisions that are provided for SEND learners, how we procure and spend money for SEND, how we teach SEND learners, what support we offer for parents, and what accountability measures we have in terms of measuring our SEND performance. So here's a pause point. Pause the presentation now and see if you can find your SEND information report on your school's website. Okay, so when we think of a SEND learner, what do we mean? Well, we can speculate, but actually the information is contained within the Special Educational Needs and Disability Code of Practice 0 to 25. So this is our key reference tool. And within there, we start to think about learners who have got persistent learning difficulties or things like around physical or motor control challenges. So again, another pause point. Can you go to the web and download a copy of the SEND Code of Practice and reference Chapter 6 relating to schools? Okay, so within Chapter 6, at 6.17 there, what do we think of when we're thinking about a learner with SEND? What does that mean? The SEND Code of Practice attempts to codify this. So it talks about following regular assessments and teaching, outcomes when we're observing pupils in the classroom. We start to think about pupils who aren't making their expected progress. So what are these things characterised by? Well, significantly lower progress than that of peers from the starting point. They're failing to make their previous rates of progress, so they aren't progressing from their previous progress points. And the attainment gap is widening between them and their peers. But also as well, we need to think about a broader area of challenge that that learner may have. For example, their social progress and their development when we're thinking about that successful transition into early adulthood. Are they not making those levels of progress? So here's another pause point for us. Does this statement align with your thinking of what a learner with SEND may have in terms of their characteristics? As well as thinking what SEND may be, we need to also be mindful of what SEND isn't. And again, the code of practice tells us to be mindful of this. When we look at 6.21, it's very clear there that behaviour in itself does not necessarily mean that a child or young person has SEND. What the code tells us is that we need to, through our assessment processes, be careful to ensure that is the learning need creating the behaviour challenge, or is this learner got a behaviour challenge in itself, in themselves? So we need to be very mindful of that. So what happens when a decision is made that a learner has SEND? Once that decision has been made, we introduce for that learner a process called the graduated response. And that learner is placed on a SEND register called at a placement, a characterisation called SEND support. So an assessment of that learner's primary need will be undertaken. And there's a range of assessments that should be undertaken for that learner. That should include pupil voice, parental voice, some psychometric assessment of need, as well as accumulating data from teachers and other key adults that may be working with that learner. We use a process called Assess, Plan, Do, Review, which will commonly be called APDR. So if you hear your school SENCO saying this learner has got an APDR, they have got a learning plan that has been produced by school, and it needs to be reviewed 3 times per academic year. And targets need to be set for that learner that you, as staff, teaching staff and support staff, should have sight of to support your work with those learners. So, but it's important to note that the primary provision for a learner at SEND support will usually be the teacher in the classroom. At this stage, we're not looking at a range of external agencies. We're not looking at a range of provisions necessarily outside the classroom. This is where we're looking for the teaching staff to support the learner with high quality assessment of primary need, backed by targets that enable that learner to make progress. So the learner is reviewed as they move through the academic year, but what happens if the learner at SEND support continues to face significant learning challenges? Well, this is another element to the SEND characterisation called Education, Health and Care Plan. So if that learner at SEND support continues not to make progress, we can offer that learner an assessment for an Education, Health and Care Plan. This is a far more formal document which has a legal basis, and the basis is that everything in the plan should be offered by the school or even college setting. And this plan can run to the age of 25 into early adulthood. So it will go beyond school, it could go into support with housing, it could go into support with health and social care as that learner progresses early into early adulthood, as well as work opportunities like apprenticeship. The only time that this plan may stop is if the learner attends university, where a different support process can be put in place for that learner. It's important to note that it's an education, health and care plan, so it should be supported by health and social care if necessary. Also, as well, additional funding is provided to support this plan, and the plan is reviewed annually. A range of support can be put in place for that learner beyond school, as I mentioned, health and social care, and provided by specialist additional services. As well as in school, you may often see that learner supported by an additional adult in the classroom. So I did mention earlier different types of SEND, different types of need. So how do we characterise SEND in schools? Well, we may have pupils with a communication and interaction challenge. And those pupils commonly have speech, language and communication needs, SLCN, or ASD, autistic spectrum disorder. Another category is social, emotional and mental health. In the press and media in our schools over the last few years, we've seen a rapid rise in these learners with some significant SCMH challenges, particularly post-COVID. And the third category is sensory and physical. These students may have visual impairment, VI, or hearing impairment, HI. And there's also cognition and learning, particularly pupils with a specific learning difficulty, SPLD, which could be dyslexia or dyscalculia. Now, you may often read that another category is within cognition and learning called MLD, moderate learning difficulties. We don't tend to use that as a characteristic within the Mercian Trust. And the reasons there are quite specific in that it's a designation that does lack precision. And it also lacks then the preciseness with which we can create targets for those learners. So it's not a designation that we tend to use. However, you may see MLD in some education, health and care plans, because that's the designation that a local authority may provide that learner. But we don't tend to use that as a designation. So you may often see these designations referred to as the 4 broad areas of need. And these, again, if you look at chapter 6 within the SEND Code of Practice, you will see these referred to. So here's another pause point. Quite often when we think of learners' needs, we can think of lots of different needs. And it may be useful to actually think about the 4 broad areas. And this will enable you as staff to start to think about some of the common characteristics those learners have got. So thinking about your own pupil lists, where would you placing those learners within those 4 broad areas? You should then start to see that actually some of these learners would have more common characteristics. So just a pause point for you to think about your own pupil lists and placing those learners within the 4 broad areas. Now we'll refer back to this when we think about every teacher and teacher SEND. But we should always be looking for opportunities to simplify our structures. SEND can often seem to be very, very broad and almost overwhelming in terms of its complexities, but it doesn't need to be that way. So actually, if we can take the opportunities to recategorize students in terms of looking for common traits, looking for common solutions, and looking for pathways for those learners, we don't have to overcomplicate the structure for those learners. Now, it's a real pleasure of mine to introduce a colleague of ours in the Mercian Trust, who's a SENCO at one of our schools, Langley, and she's going to talk about her role, how she became a SENCO, some of the challenges she faces on a day-to-day, her day-to-day journey of being SENCO, and I hope you'll find her story interesting.
Hi everybody. We're now joined by Katie Rogers. And Katie, do you just want to introduce yourself, what your role is, what you do, which school you're working in our trust? Thank you.
Yeah, so I work at Q3 Langley. I'm the SENCO and I'm part of the team. So I've got an assistant SENCO. We've got 7 LSAs and 2 LSPs as part of our team as well.
Okay, great. We'll explore that team in a bit. How long have you been SENCO for, Katie?
Yeah, so I took over as SENCO in April 2022, so just after the Easter holidays in April 2020.
That's great. So a couple of years now. So you joined during COVID? Were we in lockdown or were we out of lockdown?
No, just after COVID. So I interviewed for a position as a geography teacher and started in September 21. So sort of like first normal school year after COVID. And then I got the role as assistant Senko in October, and then Senko the following Easter. So it was quite quick.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'm not going to ask how old you are, but how long have you been in teaching for? And what's been your journey to becoming Senko?
Yeah, so I started teaching in 2018 as a geography teacher. And then in my first year of teaching, I qualified as an assessor in access arrangements. This was my previous school in Birmingham. It was something I was interested in, like the psychology side of things, and it had a lot of psychometric assessments as part of that qualification. So I did that at my old school, and then I came to Q3 Langley. And then I took up, when I started as geography teacher, I also took on the access arrangements as well before I became assistant Senko.
Okay. And so what made you interested in becoming the Senko? Is it just been a gradual journey for you, or did you have a moment and thought, oh, I want to become the Senko?
So when I did my training, my PGC training, we did a lot on special needs. I trained at Bristol University, and we had some brilliant lectures there, and it's something I was really interested in, which is why I did the access arrangement, because I saw it as a path in.
Okay.
And then I guess I was just really fortunate that the position came up at Langley when it did. So I just went for it.
Okay, and then you came into role. And
Yeah.
so how did you feel after the euphoria of getting the post and the role? What were those initial few weeks like for you? How did you land? How did you feel?
So when I became Senko or assistant
Yes,
Senko?
Senko, yeah.
It was overwhelming. I think I hadn't appreciated how much like legislation there is, and you get this huge handbook called the Senko of Practice, and you're expected to sort of know that and see how it applies in school settings, how you apply it to your setting, how the local authority works. And there are loads of different people involved at the local authority, and you need to build relationships with them. One of the biggest challenges was, I guess, taking over historical cases, so students that had input from certain services, and then carrying that on and making sure that's consistent. Yeah.
Okay, and so as part of your becoming a Senko, you had to undertake the National Senko Award.
Yeah.
So tell me about that. What was your experience of doing that? Where did you go to do that?
Yeah, so there's loads of different routes you can do that through. Some universities offer it. I actually chose an online training provider called Real Training, because I'd used those guys before for my access arrangements training. And I preferred doing it at my own pace rather than attending lectures and different things. So they were really brilliant. It was all online. I had a tutor who I could speak to, and it was broken into sort of 4 different sections. And then each section had a master's level assignment to go with like different projects.
Okay. And so what did you, in terms of adding value to your job, is it quite a practical course, or is it quite reflective, or does it require a lot of reading? Is it sort of research?
It's more reflective. I'd say I found about 50% of it helpful.
Right.
Part of it involves doing things like reviewing your SEND information report, which I'd actually already had support with through the trust, which was brilliant. So adding that extra task in was really helpful for me to consolidate some of that information I'd learned. There were lots of projects and different things. You had to lead on something whole school, so I led sort of revamping our assessment and review practice and different things like that. What I would say is it's a huge amount of work. I feel like I did it every holidays for a year, but you learn a lot of things really, really quickly.
And tell me about, let's go back to, you talked about your team, and it's you're in a big team there. Tell me about your LSAs. Tell me about how you work as a team. What what the specialisms are and so on.
Yeah, so our LSA team is made up of more experienced staff and then less experienced staff as well. So we've just had 2 new LSAs join us in September. So we have 2 LSPs. They run all the interventions. So if a child is taken out of, so we do citizenship in Year 9. Some of our students can't access that.
And LSPs are learning support
practitioners.
Practitioners, okay. And LSAs are learning support
assistants.
Okay, great. And so what's the difference in the role between the LSPs and LSAs?
Yeah, so the way that I sell it to them and staff is like the emergency services level. So the LSAs are like out there doing the groundwork. If they need to make like a 111 call, they go to the LSPs or the assistant Senko, and a 999 situation is escalated to me. So the LSAs are working there mainly in lessons. So they support students to access their learning. So we have smaller groups of students in our ACE department, which is our students who are not secondary ready, but are smaller class sizes. They work with them, and then they also work with students in core as well. LSPs do more intervention sessions, so they might be running the speech and language interventions or phonics interventions or anything that requires a student to be out of lesson. That's our LSPs that deal with that. We haven't got LSAs trained in certain areas. We're trying to upskill them in different areas so that they can work across the board, but we try and align what lessons they're in and what interventions are in with their interests.
In an early part of this presentation, we talked about primary needs and 4 broad areas of needs. What primary needs are the most prevalent at Langley?
Yeah, so our most prevalent primary need is SEMH.
Yeah.
We have quite a few children under CAMS and children with different diagnoses like ADHD, for example. So the way that we support them is through something called the Umbrella, which is a provision that's set up at Langley, where external agencies come in and do work with them. And then we also have an emotion coaching program run by the LSAs as well. Okay.
And CAMS, child and adolescents, mental health services. And that's an external provision, isn't it? That the local authority and the NHS provide.
There's a challenge with CAMS is that the wait list is really, really long. So often students who present with SEMH haven't got a diagnosis. They receive support through the Umbrella or through the Mercy and Trust before they're actually seen by a CAMS practitioner.
What has been, in terms of, you've been enrolled now for 2 years, and you went through that initial phase of, as you said, feel a bit overwhelming, and often new Senkos do say that they feel a bit overwhelmed to start with. Where would you say you are now in the job? Are you feet under the table, really comfortable, systems process flowing? Where do you feel you are?
I feel confident that I know and understand the legal side of things, and I know how the local authority works now, and I know who to call when and how procedures work, so I feel fine about that side of things. I'm continuously updating stuff and trying new stuff. So we've just moved from having 3 targets for SEN students to work on each term to having 1 target in school and 1 target at home. So something I want to try and develop this year is more interaction with parents, getting parents involved more in their child's education and increasing parent voice.
Yeah, and in terms of sort of long-term goals for SEND at Langley, where in sort of 5 years, 4 years time would you be happy with? What in terms of where you are on the journey now?
I think it would be really great to get more LSAs, LSPs and staff aware of the assessment process for adding students to the SEN register and making that really clear. And we've introduced a wave system, so teachers can see whether students are on wave 1 or wave 3, what support they require, and I think embedding those practices so staff are aware of them.
Thinking about becoming a Senko, and knowing what you know now and what you didn't know a few years ago, what advice would you give to someone who was just coming into role as a new Senko? Big question, isn't it?
If you're in Sandwell, the local authority do a new Senko course every September, which I find really, really helpful, and that helps you understand how things work. I think it's getting your head around, what I'd start with is getting your head around how all the different agencies work together, and then take time to audit the SEND register. And definitely upskilling on different courses and keeping up to date with news within the Senko website is really good for that.
And what would you say were probably the biggest frustrations in doing the role, in undertaking the role of Senko? Not that you ever seem to show any frustration with anything.
I guess one of the frustrations I have is you have a huge amount of need, and the local authority doesn't provide a huge amount of hours for you to work with specialists. So a lot of my job is trying to prioritize students and then students that maybe aren't necessarily causing as many problems or aren't presented with high needs, they take a long time to get seen. So it's just resources, I think.
Yeah.
Local authority.
And just on the point of working with parents,
Yeah.
what do you think parents can really offer us in terms of our ongoing provision for our learners? Do you think we've got a lot more to learn from parents? Do you think that we actually engage parents enough? What do you think we need to be doing in our work with parents?
So something I think we're working on with parents at the moment is teaching them how to read with their children and working with them on that. So our students do a reading test when they come into year 7 and then several times throughout Key Stage 3. And a lot of the students with difficulties in cognition and learning, but then also students who have problems with SEMH as well, their reading ages are quite low and some of their frustrations might be coming from that they're not understanding in class. And often when I talk to parents about the importance of reading, they don't know how to read with their child, what books are available. And we've got a really good library at Q3 and a librarian as well. And we did sort of a coffee afternoon last year where we invited parents in, so to teach them different strategies and the importance. So hopefully we'll continue doing that.
Yeah. And in an earlier slide, we talked about education, health and care plans and school support.
Yeah.
Just on a final note, really, how have you, what differences or difficulties have you found? Because their provision is met in different ways. So those with an education, health and care plan have that statutory provision and will probably receive more direct support from an additional adult, whereas those that send support will primarily receive their support via the teacher in the classroom. How do you manage that in terms of planning things like professional development? Because the provision is different, very different, isn't it, between those two groups?
Yeah, I think with students that send support, that's easier to manage because although there might be external agencies involved, I can sort of control about what we can offer and what we can't offer reasonably. EHCPs are more complex because they're written by the local authority. Sometimes EHCPs that we get from other schools up in primary school have things that we're legally required to offer that we don't have. And that can be challenging. In terms of staff development, so we have the inclusion support team this year are going to be coming in to do some staff training sessions and inset days and different things that are focused around specific students. And our educational psychologist is going to come and meet with the teachers of some of our high need students to explain how their needs can be met in lessons. A lot of our training is done in-house, so the LSAs have a CPD session every week, and that might be focused around supporting students with mobility issues and different things like that. Yeah.
Katie, thank you very much. I know you're a very, very busy lady, so thank you very much for your time, and enjoy the rest of your week. And while the sun's still shining, indeed, hope everything goes okay for you over there at Langley. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Conrad.
So my initial reflections of talking to Katie was that, and it's a very similar journey from when you listen and talk to Senkos that have come into post. That to start with, it's a very, very challenging role that you encounter. If you have managed to work quite closely with an experienced Senko before, that can help. And Katie was an assistant Senko that she mentioned there, but often that isn't the case. But there are support. There's support from the Immersion Trust if you were enrolled with an Immersion Trust, but wider local authority as well. But the challenges are managing the external agencies with what the expectations of parents can be and what your school can offer realistically in terms of provisions. And it's a challenge often to be able to work your way through that successfully and ensure that the learner themselves are the key priority and you're not sidetracked by all the other things that can take place, such as changes at local authority level and other changes. So just some final reflections there on the session today for you to take away and think about. Do you know how many learners that send support in the EHCPs you have in your teaching groups and across the school setting? What is the balance? What is the ratio? Do you have a lot of pupils that send support and very small numbers at EHCP? or are there quite large numbers of both? What does it look like? What are the main send needs in your school setting? And you can find all that information out through a very quick conversation with your SENCO. And again, your SENCO is there to be able to support you through the journey. It's not just when a pupil becomes SEND. If you feel at any stage you've got a learner that's not making progress, a conversation with your SEND lead can be had. So in session 2, we're going to be thinking about every teacher, a teacher of SEND, and what that actually means in reality and what it should mean. And I look forward to meeting you all again then. Thank you.